A 10-year-old homeless boy would solve in 30 seconds what 23 medical specialists couldn't fix in 6 years, pulling something unbelievable from a mafia boss's daughter's ear that would change 3 lives forever. But before that miracle in Penn Valley Park, before the screams of joy and impossible gratitude, there was only silence. Complete, devastating, 6-year-long silence that was slowly killing a man who'd never feared anything in his life. Joseph Carver, head of Kansas City's most feared crime family, stood at his mansion's floor-to-ceiling windows, watching his daughter Kate play in the garden below. And for the 4,000th time that year, he felt absolutely powerless. Kate was 6 years old and had never heard a single sound in her entire existence. Not the crack of thunder that made other children cry, not the music box her grandmother sent from Italy, not the word daddy that Joseph whispered to her every night. She moved through the world like a ghost, trapped behind invisible glass, touching her right ear constantly as if she could physically locate the barrier between herself and sound. Joseph had memorized that gesture, the small hand rising unconsciously, fingers pressing gently, head tilting slightly as hope died once more. The medical bills stacked on his desk told a story of desperation that would have seemed impossible for a man of his reputation. $67,000 across 4 states, consultations with specialists in San Francisco, Los Angeles, Seattle, even a controversial doctor in Boston who claimed miracles and delivered nothing but sophisticated ways to say, "I don't know." They'd performed audiometry tests, tympanometry, auditory brainstem response evaluations, CT scans, MRI imaging, every acronym in modern medicine deployed against an enemy that refused to show itself on any screen or readout. Joseph had built an empire on certainty, on knowing exactly how much pressure to apply and where to apply it to get desired results. He'd negotiated with cartel leaders, eliminated rivals, corrupted officials, moved millions through legitimate businesses that masked operations the FBI had been investigating for 12 years, without success. His reputation was built on cold calculation and ruthless efficiency, the kind of man who could order someone's disappearance over breakfast and never lose sleep. But watching Kate try to pronounce words by studying his lip movements, practicing syllables she'd never actually heard, destroyed him in ways bullets and betrayals never could. The mansion's security system tracked 17 cameras, motion sensors, armed guards rotating shifts around the property's perimeter. Joseph had enemies who would pay millions for access to his daughter, leverage that could dismantle everything he'd built. Yet the real threat wasn't external. It was the growing fear that Kate would live her entire life in this impossible silence, that no amount of money or power or violence could fix what was broken inside her. He'd offered specialists double their fees, threatened others, even begged one renowned audiologist in Chicago who'd looked at Kate's scans and simply shaken his head with genuine sympathy that somehow hurt worse than contempt. Kate's speech therapist came 3 times weekly, a patient woman named Dr. Brennan who taught lip reading and articulation through endless repetition. Kate had learned to say daddy by watching Joseph's mouth form the word approximately 10,000 times, memorizing the shape of lips and tongue position without ever hearing the sound it produced. When she said it, her voice flat and uncertain, because she couldn't hear herself. Joseph's chest tightened with pride and grief simultaneously. The other crime families whispered that Joseph Carver had gone soft, that fatherhood had dulled his edge. His second-in-command, Frank, had mentioned it carefully during last month's meeting, suggesting that rivals were noticing the distraction, testing boundaries. Joseph had put his gun on the conference table without comment, and the whispers stopped, but the truth remained. He was compromised in ways that would have gotten him killed 10 years ago. Every decision now filtered through the lens of Kate's future. Every risk assessment included calculations about leaving her alone in this world if something went wrong. His phone contained contact information for specialists he'd never called, experimental treatments in countries without FDA approval, even a faith healer in New Mexico that Frank had mentioned with embarrassed reluctance. Joseph had researched them all at 3 a.m. when sleep wouldn't come, when the silence of the house felt like it was mocking his daughter's permanent isolation. He'd grown up in Chicago's worst neighborhoods, clawed his way to power through intelligence and brutality, survived attempts on his life from enemies and supposed friends alike, but none of that prepared him for the helplessness of watching Kate live behind glass. The medical terminology had become sickeningly familiar. Conductive hearing loss versus sensorineural, cochlear function, ossicular chain integrity, temporal bone abnormalities. Joseph could discuss auditory pathology with the fluency of someone who'd spent 6 years studying nothing else, who'd read journals and textbooks trying to find some answer the specialists had missed. But every paper ended the same way: recommended additional testing, suggested monitoring progression, advised developing coping strategies. Kate's bedroom was soundproofed, a cruel irony that Joseph recognized but couldn't change. The walls blocked noise that she couldn't hear anyway, protection against a world that had already locked her out. Her toys included visual learning tools, books with pictures, puzzles that taught through patterns rather than sounds. Other children her age were learning to read through phonics. Kate was learning through pure memorization, associating written words with objects and concepts without the bridge of sound. The garden below showed Kate playing with a ball, bouncing it against the mansion's stone wall in rhythms she created through sight rather than sound. She'd developed her own games that didn't require hearing, activities that worked in silence. Joseph watched her adapt with resilience that shamed his own despair, but he couldn't shake the fury at the universe for placing this burden on a child who'd done nothing to deserve it. His sister-in-law Margaret had suggested sign language, a practical solution that made Joseph irrationally angry. Learning signs felt like surrender, admission that Kate would never hear, that they should stop fighting and accept this permanent silence. He'd snapped at Margaret in a way he immediately regretted, his frustration misdirected at someone who only wanted to help. The clock on his desk showed 2:47 p.m. on a Thursday in June, Kansas City heat making the garden shimmer beyond the windows. In approximately 4 hours, Joseph would take Kate to Penn Valley Park for their weekly routine, letting her run and play in public spaces where she could be almost normal. He didn't know that today would be different, that a homeless boy would approach them with knowledge that 23 specialists had missed. Right now, standing at these windows watching his daughter exist in silence, Joseph Carver only knew desperation, the kind that made powerful men consider impossible things, that made ruthless criminals pray to gods they'd abandoned, that made fathers willing to burn the world down if it would give their children what they needed. He'd killed men for far less than what fate had done to Kate, but there was no enemy to eliminate, no throat to cut, no negotiation to win. Kate looked up at his window and waved, her smile bright and genuine despite everything she couldn't hear. Joseph waved back, his reflection in the glass showing lines that hadn't been there 6 years ago, gray threading through dark hair that used to be solid black. His hands trembled slightly, a weakness he'd never allow anyone else to see, as he pressed his palm against the window. 3 miles across Kansas City, in the shadowed doorway of an abandoned warehouse near the River District, Ezra Park woke to Thursday morning heat already pressing against concrete and metal like a living thing. He was 10 years old and had been homeless for 3 years, surviving through a combination of invisibility, strategic kindness, and the moral code his mother had burned into him before the fire took her away. The doorway was his current sleeping spot, 5th location this month, chosen because freight trucks blocked sight lines from the street, and morning sun hit late enough to let him sleep past dawn, without police rousting him from doorways they considered blight on Kansas City's slowly gentrifying warehouse district. Ezra's survival strategy was deceptively simple: be useful, never threatening, always moving. He'd learned that homeless children triggered different responses than homeless adults: more pity, more danger, more attention from authorities who'd put him in foster care faster than he could explain why group homes felt like cages. His mother had taught him never to beg, because begging killed dignity, and never to steal because stealing killed soul, so he'd built existence around the third option, offering help in exchange for what he needed. Diners got tables wiped and floors swept for breakfast scraps. Barbershops got trash emptied for bathroom access. Grocery stores got carts returned for occasional damaged goods they couldn't sell anyway. The technique required reading people with accuracy that kept him alive. Ezra could spot generous versus dangerous within 3 seconds of observation, identifying who might help and who might hurt based on micro-expressions his mother had taught him to recognize. She'd been a nurse before addiction, and bad choices put them in shelters. And she'd explained how reading pain in patients' faces could mean the difference between life and death. His backpack contained everything he owned: 2 shirts, 1 pair of pants, a blanket his mother had wrapped him in during the fire, a water bottle he refilled at public fountains, and a small notebook where he tracked which businesses allowed his help, and which days they were most receptive. The notebook was strategy guide and survival manual, documenting patterns that kept him fed and relatively safe. Ezra rolled his blanket with practiced efficiency, stuffing it into his backpack alongside clothes that needed washing more desperately each day. Public library bathrooms provided sinks for basic hygiene, though he had to time visits carefully to avoid librarians who'd grown suspicious of the small boy who came in dirty and left slightly cleaner. Staying clean was essential to his strategy. People helped clean homeless kids more readily than dirty ones, as if soap somehow made poverty more acceptable. The memories of his mother came in fragments now. 3 years after smoke filled the shelter and she pushed him toward exits while staying behind. He couldn't recall her face with clarity anymore. Just impressions of warmth, the sensation of her hand holding his, the sound of her humming songs he couldn't name anymore. She died when he was 7, and the intervening years had blurred her into feeling rather than concrete image. What remained sharp was her teaching, the lessons about dignity, about helping others, about surviving without losing yourself to desperation that turned people into things they'd hate. His father had disappeared 6 months before the fire, walking out after a fight Ezra only partially remembered. There'd been yelling about money and drugs and futures that didn't exist, and then his father was gone, just another person who'd decided survival was easier alone than with family dragging behind. The shelter fire haunted him in ways he couldn't articulate. He remembered alarm bells screaming through hallways, his mother's hands on his shoulders guiding him forward, the push toward exit doors that felt like flying and falling simultaneously. He'd gotten out and turned back to see flames eating the building's second floor, smoke pouring from windows like the structure was exhaling death. They'd told him later that she died from smoke inhalation, that she didn't suffer, as if that clinical description somehow made loss more bearable than knowing she'd suffocated while saving him. Ezra had spent 3 months in foster care immediately after, a home with 4 other kids and parents who meant well, but treated children like assembly line products requiring minimal individual attention. He'd run after the father hit one of the younger kids for breaking a dish, unwilling to wait around to see if he'd be next. The streets felt safer than homes where violence hid behind closed doors, where being fed and sheltered came with costs he wasn't willing to pay. He'd been running ever since, staying invisible, staying useful, staying alive through strategies his mother had inadvertently taught him. Morton's Diner appeared through morning haze at 6:47 a.m., its neon sign flickering intermittently with electrical issues management never quite fixed. The morning manager, Phil, was already inside prepping for breakfast rush, and he spotted Ezra through the window, with the resigned nod that meant permission granted. Ezra slipped inside through the back entrance, grabbed a cleaning cloth from the supply closet, and began wiping down tables with the thoroughness that kept this arrangement functioning. The breakfast came 20 minutes later. Pancakes, eggs, 2 strips of bacon, orange juice, and coffee that Phil added without asking, because he'd noticed Ezra's constant exhaustion. It was more food than necessary for table wiping, generosity that Phil disguised as payment for labor, so Ezra's pride could survive charity. They never discussed the arrangement explicitly. Phil set food down. Ezra ate. Both pretended it was purely transactional, rather than the kindness it actually was. After breakfast, Ezra walked to the public library, timing arrival for 9:15, when morning rush had cleared, but librarians weren't yet monitoring bathrooms for homeless people using sinks. He washed his face and hands with paper towels and hand soap, finger-combed hair that desperately needed proper cutting, and changed into his cleaner shirt. The reflection in the mirror showed a small boy with dark circles under eyes that had seen too much, features that might be Korean or mixed race, though he'd never known enough family history to be certain. The library also provided air conditioning and books, hours of escape into stories where children had adventures instead of survival strategies. Ezra had read everything in the juvenile section twice, gravitating toward fantasies where orphans discovered magical powers or secret destinies that transformed their circumstances. He knew these were lies. No magic was coming to save him. No destiny was waiting beyond daily grind of finding food and shelter. But the temporary escape felt necessary. By 2:00 p.m., Kansas City heat had become oppressive, the kind that made concrete radiate like ovens and air feel thick enough to chew. Ezra had earned $3 helping an elderly woman carry groceries to her car, money he'd use for dinner at the convenience store where clerks pretended not to notice him eating purchased items before reaching the register. But right now, he needed relief from heat, which meant heading to Penn Valley Park, where trees provided shade, and water fountains provided hydration, and families provided cover for a homeless boy to rest without attracting attention. The park was his Thursday afternoon ritual, a place where he could sit on benches and observe families with the careful attention that kept him alive. He'd learned to read body language there, the parents who watched their children with casual affection versus those who hovered with anxiety, the kids who played with inclusive joy versus those who bullied with parental permission. These observations were survival data, teaching him about human nature in ways that protected him from predators and helped him identify rare, genuinely kind people worth approaching for help. Joseph's Mercedes pulled into Penn Valley Park's parking area at exactly 6:32 p.m. Precision timing that was habit from years of operations where minutes mattered and tardiness could mean death. Kate sat in the back seat, playing with a puzzle toy that taught shapes through visual logic, her small hands manipulating pieces with the concentration of someone who'd learned that focus compensated for missing senses. She looked up when the car stopped, recognizing the park through windows with excitement that made Joseph's chest ache. This was her favorite place, the weekly routine where she could run and play like other children, pretending normalcy for precious hours. The park was moderately crowded for Thursday evening, families escaping indoor heat for outdoor heat that at least included breezes and space to move. Children swarmed the playground equipment, while parents watched from benches, the usual ecosystem of suburban life that Joseph observed with trained caution. His security team was positioned discreetly, 2 men in a vehicle near the parking lot, one disguised as jogger making circuits around the park's perimeter. Kate couldn't know about them because childhood should include illusions of safety, but Joseph never operated without protection for his most valuable vulnerability. Kate bolted from the car the moment her seatbelt released, running toward the fountain with energy that 6 years of silence hadn't dampened. Joseph followed at measured pace, his eyes scanning the crowd with automatic threat assessment that never stopped even in spaces designed for recreation. He noted the young mothers with strollers near the playground, the teenage couple making out under a tree, the elderly man feeding pigeons by the fountain, the small boy reading on a bench. The fountain had become Kate's obsession during these visits, the water's movement providing visual stimulation that sound might have offered other children. She'd stand at its edge watching patterns, tracking drops and splashes with focus that suggested she was trying to understand something beyond visual data. Joseph wondered if she was trying to hear the water, if some part of her brain still reached for senses that didn't work, trying to fill the gap with intensity of observation. He positioned himself on a bench 20 feet from the fountain, close enough to intervene in emergencies, but far enough to let Kate have independence. The evening sun cast long shadows across grass that needed cutting, heat still radiating from concrete pathways even as temperature dropped toward tolerable. Other parents chatted with each other, their children's laughter providing soundtrack that Kate couldn't hear, creating community through sound that constantly excluded his daughter. Ezra had noticed them immediately when they arrived. Impossible not to notice the expensive car. The man who moved like violence was his native language. The small girl who ran with joy but touched her ear with unconscious repetition. He'd been watching families for 3 hours, reading dynamics and body language, but these two arrested his attention in ways that triggered recognition he couldn't initially name. Something about the girl's movements felt familiar, her head tilts and focused lip-reading reminding him of something buried in memory's fragments that wouldn't quite surface. The man was dangerous. Ezra's survival instinct screamed warnings about approaching someone who carried himself with that particular combination of control and contained threat. His clothes were expensive but practical. His posture suggested weapons and training. His constant scanning of surroundings marked him as someone who expected attacks. This was not a person to approach carelessly, not someone who'd welcome homeless boy offering unsolicited observations about his daughter. Every survival lesson Ezra had learned said stay invisible, stay away, don't risk interaction with people who could destroy you without effort. But the girl's ear-touching continued, and suddenly memory surfaced with clarity that made Ezra's breath catch. 3 years ago, before the fire, his mother had helped their neighbor, Mr. Chen, who'd complained about hearing loss for weeks. She'd examined his ear with flashlight and patience, explaining to 7-year-old Ezra what she was seeing. Impacted cerumen, earwax that had built up and blocked the canal completely. She'd used warm water and gentle pressure, flushing the blockage out in pieces, until suddenly Mr. Chen could hear again, his relief and gratitude disproportionate to the simplicity of the solution. Ezra watched the girl touch her ear, for the 4th time in 2 minutes, saw her tilt her head the exact way Mr. Chen had tilted his, recognized the unconscious gesture of someone trying to physically access hearing that wasn't working. Medical specialists had probably examined her. Rich families like this had access to resources that people like Ezra couldn't imagine. But sometimes the simplest explanations got overlooked in favor of complex diagnoses. The decision to approach felt like stepping off a cliff, every survival instinct screaming objections, while something deeper pushed him forward. His mother had taught him that helping others mattered more than personal safety, that using knowledge to reduce suffering was moral obligation regardless of risk. She died pushing him toward exits while staying in danger herself, sacrificing her safety for his. And the least he could do was honor that lesson by taking risks to help others when he could. Ezra stood from his bench with legs that trembled slightly, his book forgotten as he walked toward the fountain where the girl played. Each step felt heavier than the last, fear building as the dangerous man's attention shifted toward him with laser focus that suggested recognition of threat approaching his daughter. Ezra raised his hand slightly in universal gesture of non-aggression, trying to appear non-threatening even as his heart hammered against ribs with force that felt like it might crack bone. Joseph saw the homeless boy approaching, and his hand moved automatically toward the gun concealed under his jacket, fingers touching grip with practiced readiness. The boy was small and obviously poor, clothes worn and face too thin, but size didn't determine danger. Joseph had seen children used as distractions, as weapons, as sacrifices by enemies who understood that targets lowered guards around kids. His body coiled with readiness to eliminate threat if the boy made any move toward Kate, protective instinct overriding any hesitation about using lethal force in public spaces. But the boy stopped 10 feet away, hands raised, eyes showing fear, but also determination that seemed strange for someone clearly terrified. "Please don't hurt me," Ezra said, his voice cracking slightly with stress that made him sound younger than 10. "I think I know what's wrong with your daughter. I think I can help her here." The words came out rushed, desperate, like he expected violence before he could finish explaining, like he was taking enormous risk for reasons Joseph couldn't immediately comprehend. Joseph's hand stayed on his weapon but didn't draw, his mind processing the statement through layers of suspicion and desperate hope that warred inside him. This was obviously a scam. Homeless kid approaching rich Mark with impossible promise, setting up some scheme to extract money or create distraction for accomplices. Nobody fixed hearing loss in parks, especially not homeless children without medical training, especially not conditions that 23 specialists had declared unsolvable. The logical response was to wave the boy away, maybe give him $20 to disappear, protect Kate from whatever con this was supposed to be. But something in the boy's eyes stopped Joseph's dismissal, some quality of genuine belief that didn't match con artist patterns. The kid looked terrified but sincere, like he actually believed what he was saying, like he was risking danger because he thought he could help, rather than because he smelled opportunity. Joseph had spent 20 years reading people. Separating liars from truth-tellers kept you alive in his business, and this boy wasn't lying. "You have 10 seconds to explain before I break your arm," Joseph said quietly, his voice carrying threat that made Ezra flinch visibly. "My daughter has been seen by specialists across 4 states. What makes you think a homeless kid knows something they don't?" The question was test. If the boy ran or fumbled for explanation, Joseph would dismiss him and tighten security to prevent similar approaches. Ezra swallowed hard, forcing words past fear that made his throat tight and his hands shake. "She touches her ear constantly and tilts her head trying to hear better. That's exactly what my neighbor did before my mom helped him. He had earwax blocking his canal completely. The doctors couldn't find anything wrong either because they were looking for complicated problems, not simple blockages." He spoke quickly, racing against the 10-second deadline, praying that explanation would buy him more time before violence happened. "My mom was a nurse. She taught me." "I'm not lying. I swear I'm not lying." The desperation in his voice was raw and genuine, the kind of honesty that couldn't be manufactured by someone trying to run a con. The explanation hit Joseph like physical impact, medical possibility that nobody had mentioned, despite $67,000 spent on consultations and tests. Impacted cerumen was basic enough that specialists wouldn't focus on it. Too simple, too obvious, too beneath their expertise to warrant serious consideration. But simple didn't mean impossible, and obvious problems sometimes got overlooked because everyone assumed someone else had already checked. Joseph's grip on his weapon loosened slightly as hope and skepticism fought inside him, desperately wanting to believe while knowing belief had destroyed him repeatedly over 6 years. Kate had noticed them talking and walked over with curious expression that suggested questions about why her father was talking to a boy her age. She looked at Ezra with open interest, unmarred by the threat assessment that Joseph automatically applied to every interaction, seeing him as potential friend rather than potential danger. Her hand rose unconsciously to touch her ear again, that habitual gesture that had haunted Joseph for 6 years, and Ezra's eyes tracked the movement with recognition that seemed to confirm his diagnosis. "Let me look," Ezra said, his voice steadier now that he'd delivered his explanation without immediate violence. "Just look. If I'm wrong, I'll leave and never bother you again." But if he was right, he didn't finish the sentence because the implications were too enormous, the possibility too fragile to voice without risking its destruction. If he was right, this girl could hear for the first time ever. If he was right, he could give her something that money and power couldn't buy. If he was right, everything could change in 30 seconds that would feel like 30 years. Joseph's hand remained on his weapon while internal calculation ran scenarios at lightning speed. Risk of letting stranger approach Kate versus potential reward of solution that had eluded everyone else. The logical choice was refusal, protecting daughter from unknown threat regardless of possible benefit. But 6 years of failure had exhausted logic's authority, had created desperation that made impossible risks feel worth taking. And something about this terrified boy who risked approaching dangerous stranger to help child he didn't know suggested sincerity that Joseph's instincts recognized as genuine. "You have 30 seconds, Joseph said finally, his voice carrying weight of absolute deadline that would result in severe consequences if betrayed. "Touch her wrong, hurt her in any way, and you won't leave this park alive." The security team had closed formation without being obvious about it. 3 men now positioned in triangle around the bench area where this drama was unfolding. They'd worked with Joseph long enough to read his body language fluently, understanding that this situation was balanced on knife's edge between violence and something else entirely, something none of them had protocols for because it existed outside normal threat assessment parameters. The lead security guard had his hand inside his jacket touching his weapon, watching the homeless boy with intensity that would result in immediate lethal response if anything went wrong, but also with curiosity about what would happen next, because Joseph's hesitation was unprecedented in situations involving potential threats to Kate. Ezra's mind raced through everything his mother had taught him about ear examinations, knowledge he'd absorbed at 7 years old without understanding it would become relevant 3 years later in a park where his life depended on memory's accuracy. She'd explained about the eardrum's fragility, how pressure had to be distributed carefully, how impacted cerumen could become hard as concrete if left long enough, but could still be extracted with patience and proper technique. The neighbor, Mr. Chen, had been elderly with poor hygiene habits that led to massive buildup, but Ezra had watched his mother work for 20 minutes with warm water and cotton swabs, and fingernails used as delicate tools until the blockage finally yielded, and Mr. Chen's hearing returned with clarity that made him weep with relief and gratitude. Kate's trust in this moment felt like gift Ezra didn't deserve, innocence that hadn't been corrupted by knowledge of how dangerous strangers could be, or how often adults disappointed children who depended on them. She studied Ezra's face with open curiosity, unmarred by the suspicion that her father projected constantly, seeing him as potential friend rather than threat requiring evaluation. Her willingness to let him examine her ear came from 6 years of medical appointments, where strangers had poked and prodded and tested without ever finding answers, building tolerance for discomfort, if it might lead to solution that had eluded everyone else who'd tried and failed repeatedly. The evening sun had dropped another degree toward horizon, casting longer shadows across the park and painting everything in golden light that felt almost sacred for moment happening between them. Families were beginning to pack up their picnic supplies and gather children for dinners at home, normal Thursday routines continuing around them while 3 people existed in bubble where time moved differently and stakes were impossibly high. Birds continued their evening songs in trees overhead. Wind kept rustling through leaves with whispers Kate couldn't hear yet. Fountain kept splashing with rhythms that existed in silence for her. But all of that was about to change if Ezra's hand stayed steady, and his memory proved accurate, and luck decided to favor homeless boy who'd already survived more than most people faced an entire lifetime. Mez. The threat was explicit and completely sincere. Promise of violence that would follow any hint of danger to Kate. Joseph's other hand moved to his phone, signaling his security team to close in without making their presence obvious. Insurance policy against whatever might happen in the next half-minute. 2 men materialized from different directions, positioning themselves within sprinting distance while maintaining casual appearances that wouldn't alarm park visitors. Ezra nodded frantically, relief and terror mixing an expression that made him look even younger than 10. He approached Kate slowly, kneeling to her eye level with movements designed to appear non-threatening to both the girl and her father. "Hi," he said softly, knowing she couldn't hear him but hoping she could read lips. "My name is Ezra. Can I look in your ear?" He pointed to his own ear, then to hers. using gestures to bridge the communication gap that words couldn't cross. Kate looked at her father for permission, reading his face with the skill she'd developed from 6 years of relying on visual cues. Joseph nodded once, his jaw tight with tension that made muscles stand out like cables under skin, his entire body coiled to intervene instantly if anything went wrong. Kate turned back to Ezra and tilted her head, granting access to her ear with trust that made Ezra's hands tremble as he gently brushed her hair aside. He positioned himself to catch maximum light from the setting sun, angling Kate's head slightly to illuminate the ear canal as deeply as possible. The light revealed what it should have revealed years ago if anyone had thought to look this carefully, this specifically, this insistently, for the simplest explanation. Deep in Kate's ear canal, visible only because Ezra knew exactly what to look for and exactly where light needed to hit, was a massive compacted cerumen that had built up over years. It was dark brown and dense, pressed against her eardrum with pressure that must have been constant discomfort she'd learned to ignore because she'd never known anything different. The blockage was complete and total, explaining 6 years of silence with answer so simple that 23 specialists had missed it entirely. Ezra's breath caught with recognition and vindication, and sudden overwhelming responsibility of what came next. "I can see it," he said, looking up at Joseph with eyes that reflected both triumph and fear. "There's a blockage. It's earwax, but it's been there so long it's become hard and compacted. That's why she can't hear. It's blocking everything from reaching her eardrum." Joseph's world narrowed to tunnel vision, focused on the boy's face, searching for any sign of deception or manipulation. But Ezra's expression showed only genuine discovery and nervous excitement of someone who'd just confirmed what he suspected. "Can you remove it?" Joseph asked, his voice barely controlled despite the hurricane of emotion tearing through his chest. "Can you fix this right here, right now?" Ezra bit his lip, weighing honesty against the dangerous hope building in the man's eyes. "I think so. My mom did it for our neighbor, but it has to be done carefully. If I push wrong or use too much pressure, I could damage her eardrum. I need her to stay completely still, and I need you to trust me for about 60 seconds. The request was enormous, asking a man who trusted no one to place his daughter's welfare in the hands of a homeless child he'd met 3 minutes ago. Joseph's grip on Ezra's wrist was sudden and brutal, fingers wrapping around bone with pressure that made the boy gasp in pain. "If you hurt her, if you make this worse, if this is some kind of game..." Joseph didn't finish the threat, because words couldn't adequately convey the violence he'd unleash if his daughter suffered any harm from this decision. His eyes communicated everything his voice didn't, promises of consequences that would make death feel merciful. Ezra nodded through the pain radiating up his arm, understanding completely what was being promised. "I know. I understand. I won't hurt her. I swear." His voice cracked with the weight of responsibility he was accepting, aware that his life literally depended on the next 60 seconds going perfectly. Joseph released his wrist, but didn't move away, his presence a constant threat that made Ezra's hands shake as he turned back to Kate. Kate watched the interaction with confusion, but not fear, reading her father's intensity as protection rather than threat to the boy helping her. Ezra smiled at her with effort that fought through his terror, trying to project calm confidence he absolutely didn't feel. "This might feel weird, but it won't hurt," he said, exaggerating his lip movements so she could follow. "You have to stay very, very still. Can you do that for me?" Kate nodded solemnly, sensing the importance of the moment even without understanding its full implications. She'd spent 6 years learning to read situations through visual cues and body language, developing alternative senses that compensated for missing sound. The tension radiating from her father and the nervous determination in Ezra's face told her this mattered in ways she couldn't yet comprehend, that she needed to be brave and still and perfect. Ezra positioned Kate to maximize sunlight penetration into her ear canal, tilting her head at precise angle his mother had taught him years ago. The compacted cerumen would need to be extracted carefully, piece by piece if necessary, working from outside edges inward to avoid pushing the mass deeper against her eardrum. His mother's voice echoed in memory. Gentle pressure, patience over speed. Never force what doesn't move easily. He took a breath that felt like it might be his last, then reached toward Kate's ear, with fingers that trembled, despite his desperate attempts at steadiness. Joseph's hand remained on his own weapon, body coiled with barely restrained violence that would explode if anything went wrong. The security team had closed to within 20 feet, hands hovering near concealed weapons. waiting for signal that would unleash coordinated attack on a 10-year-old boy if circumstances required. The initial contact with Kate's ear was gentle enough that she barely registered the touch. Ezra's fingertips exploring the outer canal with medical precision his mother had demonstrated years ago on Neighbor who'd become case study in technique, that Ezra was now replicating under circumstances infinitely more stressful. He could feel texture differences as he worked deeper, smooth skin transitioning to waxy buildup that had hardened over years of accumulation, creating barrier that was simultaneously fragile and stubbornly resistant to casual examination. The specialists who'd examined Kate had probably looked in her ear with otoscopes and fancy equipment, but they'd looked for complex pathologies and missed simple mechanical obstruction because it seemed too obvious to warrant serious consideration from experts who'd spent decades studying sophisticated medical conditions. Kate's breathing had become shallow with concentration and slight nervousness. Her body held rigid with effort to remain perfectly still like Ezra had requested. She watched her father's face for reassurance, reading his expression with skill developed over 6 years of depending on visual cues to navigate world that excluded her from auditory information everyone else used automatically. Joseph's face showed tension that bordered on panic barely contained, jaw muscles working constantly as he fought impulses to intervene and protect his daughter from potential harm that logic said was minimal, but paternal instinct screamed was catastrophic waiting to happen. The compacted cerumen was deeper than Ezra had initially estimated, extending farther into Kate's ear canal than the blockage he'd watched his mother remove from Mr. Chen's ear. It felt dense and waxy, but not wet. Years of accumulation had created mass that was almost solid, compressed against itself, and the canal walls with pressure that must have been constant discomfort Kate had learned to ignore because she'd never known anything different. Ezra adjusted his approach based on what he was feeling, using technique his mother had called progressive extraction, where you worked from outside edges inward, never pushing deeper but always pulling outward in careful increments that prevented forcing blockage against eardrum where real damage could occur. Sweat dripped down Ezra's back, despite evening temperature being reasonable. Stress-induced perspiration that came from awareness that this moment would define whether he lived or died in the next 60 seconds. His mother's voice echoed in memory with instructions she'd given during Mr. Chen's extraction. Patience over speed, gentle pressure over force, work with the blockage's natural loosening rather than fighting against its resistance. She'd made earwax removal sound almost philosophical, lesson in working with reality rather than against it, accepting that some things couldn't be rushed without causing damage that would make situation worse than original problem. Ezra channeled that teaching now, forcing himself to work slowly, despite pressure from Joseph's presence, and knowledge that his life depended on success, measured in millimeters of progress. Ezra's fingers made contact with the outer edge of the compacted wax, feeling its hardness and depth with touch made hypersensitive by fear and adrenaline. The blockage was more extensive than he'd initially thought, years of accumulation creating barrier that explained complete hearing loss. He began working at the edges, using fingernails to carefully separate the mass from the ear canal walls, his movements microscopic and deliberate. Kate remained perfectly still, her trust in this strange boy absolute, despite the bizarre nature of what was happening. She couldn't hear Ezra's whispered encouragements or her father's barely controlled breathing, existed in the same silence that had defined her entire life. But she felt the careful pressure of Ezra's work, the slight discomfort of manipulation deep in her ear, the growing sense that something fundamental was changing. The compacted cerumen began yielding to Ezra's patient pressure, separating from the canal wall in fragments that made removal possible. He worked with concentration that blocked out everything else. The dangerous man ready to kill him, the watching security team, the families playing nearby in oblivious normalcy. His entire universe narrowed to Kate's ear canal, and the blockage that had stolen 6 years of her life, that had defeated specialists and destroyed a father's faith in anything beyond his own power. Minutes passed like hours while Ezra worked, extracting the compacted mass piece by careful piece. Joseph watched with eyes that burned from refusing to blink, afraid that closing them for even a second might miss some crucial moment where intervention became necessary. Kate's hand found her father's free hand, squeezing it with pressure that communicated both trust and nervous anticipation, understanding that something important was happening even if she couldn't hear the explanations. The final fragment of compacted cerumen came free with resistance that made Ezra's heart stop, terrified he'd pushed too hard or damaged something irreparable. But then it was out, sitting in his palm like evidence of miracle or disaster. depending on what happened next. The blockage that had sealed Kate's ear canal for 6 years, maybe her entire life, was gone, leaving clear passage for sound to reach her eardrum for the first time ever. Ezra looked at Joseph with expression mixing triumph, terror, and desperate hope. "It's out," he whispered, his voice barely audible even to himself. "The blockage is completely removed. If I'm right about what was causing her hearing loss, she should be able to hear now." The statement hung in evening air like prayer or curse, possibility too enormous to fully process, outcome that would determine whether Ezra left this park alive or in a body bag. Joseph's grip on Ezra's wrist returned, less brutal this time but no less firm, anchor point connecting them in the moment before everything either changed or fell apart. Kate sat between them, still tilted at the angle Ezra had positioned her, unaware that the barrier between her and sound had just been removed, that her entire reality was about to transform in ways she couldn't imagine because she'd never experienced what she was about to experience. Silence stretched between the three of them. Ezra and Joseph locked in eye contact, waited with desperate hope and promised violence, Kate waiting patiently for someone to indicate what happened next. The park continued around them in oblivious normalcy, children laughing at distances Kate couldn't hear yet, birds singing songs still outside her awareness, wind rustling through trees with sounds that hadn't reached her ears in 6 years, or possibly ever. But the pathway was cleared now, the blockage removed, and in seconds or minutes, sound would either rush in to fill the vacuum, or nothing would change, and hope would die again in the most devastating way possible. Joseph released Ezra's wrist and turned fully toward his daughter, his hands trembling as he reached for her face. "Kate," he said, his voice breaking on her name with emotion he could no longer contain. "Kate, can you hear me?" The question was prayer and demand, and desperate plea wrapped in 2 words that represented 6 years of failure and 1 impossible moment of hope, that a homeless boy might have accomplished what an empire's worth of resources couldn't achieve. Silence held for 3 heartbeats that felt like 3 centuries, while Kate processed her father's question through lip reading that had been her only access to language for 6 years. She started to respond with practiced sign, indicating she understood the words by reading his lips, the automatic gesture she'd developed to confirm comprehension without sound. But then her face changed, shifted from practiced response to genuine confusion, from understanding to discovery, from lifetime of silence to first recognition that something was different. Her eyes widened with shock that rippled through her entire body, small frame going rigid with the intensity of sensory experience she'd never encountered before. Wind chose that exact moment to gust through Penn Valley Park, rustling leaves with whisper that billions of people heard every day without thought. But to Kate, that whisper was thunder, explosion of sensation that had no context in her experience, information reaching her brain through pathways that had never successfully transmitted signal before this moment. She gasped, actually gasped, and the sound of her own breath terrified and amazed her simultaneously. Kate's hand flew to her mouth in shock, and that movement produced tiny, rustling sounds from her clothes that reached her ears and registered as something new, something impossible, something that made her brain scramble to process data it had never received before. Tears spilled down her cheeks instantly, automatic response to overwhelming sensation that rewired reality in real time. "Daddy?" she whispered, and this time she heard herself say the word for the first time in her entire life, the sound of her own voice, flat and unpracticed because she'd never been able to hear herself to modulate tone or volume, shocked her into complete stillness. She'd said this word 10,000 times, practicing pronunciation through lip reading alone, but hearing it was completely different, foreign and familiar and devastating all at once. Her voice sounded wrong to her, strange in ways she couldn't articulate because she had no reference point for comparison. Joseph made a sound somewhere between laugh and sob, his carefully maintained control shattering completely in the face of his daughter's transformation. "Yes, baby, yes, I'm here," he said, pulling her into his arms with the kind of desperate relief that only parents who'd watched their children suffer could understand. Kate buried her face against his chest and heard his heartbeat for the first time, steady rhythm that had always been there, but had existed in silence until this impossible moment, in a park where everything changed, because a homeless boy remembered his mother's kindness. Ezra watched them with tears streaming down his own face, the weight of what he'd just accomplished hitting him with force that made his knees weak. He'd given this girl something her father's entire empire couldn't buy, had honored his mother's memory by using what she'd taught him to transform someone's life. The magnitude of the moment crushed and elevated him simultaneously. He was witnessing miracle he'd created, change that would ripple forward in ways he couldn't begin to predict. Kate pulled back from her father suddenly, her face cycling through expressions that tried to process sensory overload happening in real time. Children were laughing somewhere nearby, sounds she'd never experienced before, and the laughter reached her ears with clarity that made her head swivel trying to locate its source. A dog barked 3 benches away, and Kate jumped at the sharp sound, startled by noise that had always existed in her world, but never reached her awareness until now. "Everything is so loud," she said, her voice rising with emotion that bordered on panic. The acoustics of her own speech confused her because she'd never heard echo, never understood how sound traveled and reflected, never experienced the way her voice sounded different in open air versus enclosed spaces. Joseph held her tighter, grounding her through touch, while her auditory system tried to make sense of 6 years of silence, being replaced by overwhelming cascade of information. Birds sang in trees overhead, simple sounds that most people filtered out as background noise. But to Kate they were extraordinary. She tilted her head up, staring at branches with expression of wonder that transformed her entire face. "What is that?" she asked, pointing upward, her voice filled with awe at sounds that were simultaneously beautiful and completely foreign. Joseph followed her gaze, understanding hitting him that she'd never heard birdsong before, that every sound was discovery and education simultaneously. "Those are birds singing," he explained, his voice thick with emotion he'd spent 20 years learning to suppress but couldn't contain anymore. "They sing all the time. You just couldn't hear them before." The explanation was inadequate for the experience Kate was having, words failing to capture the transformation happening inside her brain as neural pathways activated for the first time, processing information they'd been designed to receive, but had never successfully accessed. Kate looked at Ezra with expression that mixed gratitude, confusion, and overwhelming emotion she couldn't name. "Thank you," she whispered, and this time she heard herself express gratitude, heard the emotion in her own voice even if she didn't yet understand how to control tone or modulation. Ezra nodded because he couldn't speak past the lump in his throat, couldn't find words adequate for what he was witnessing, couldn't process that his mother's teaching had led to this moment where a girl heard her world for the first time. More sounds reached Kate in waves that felt relentless. Car engines from the parking lot, footsteps on concrete pathways, wind chimes from someone's porch beyond the park boundaries, the fountain's water splashing in rhythms she'd watched but never heard. Each new sound required processing, categorization, understanding that 6-year-old brain had to accomplish instantly without the gradual development most people experienced from birth. The cognitive load was enormous, exhausting, exhilarating in ways that made her cling to her father while simultaneously wanting to explore every sound source. A child's scream of delight from the playground equipment made Kate jump violently, her entire body reacting to sound she interpreted as alarm, before context could provide reassurance that it was joy rather than danger. Joseph felt her startled response and held her tighter, understanding that her brain was having to learn instantly what most people learned gradually over years of development: how to categorize sounds, how to filter important from unimportant, how to understand context that determined whether noise required action or could be safely ignored. The scream was followed by laughter, and Kate's face shifted from fear to confusion to tentative smile as she recognized the emotional quality of sounds, even though she couldn't yet distinguish their meanings with accuracy that came from experience. Ezra watched Kate's transformation with understanding that came from his own experience, adapting to impossible circumstances, recognizing in her face the overwhelm he'd felt when his mother died, and he'd had to learn survival skills overnight that most people never needed to develop at all. The difference was that Kate's overwhelm came from abundance rather than absence, from too much sensation rather than too little safety, from world opening up rather than closing down. But the cognitive load was similar, demand on brain to process and adapt and function despite fundamental reality being completely different from what came before. He wanted to tell her it would get easier, that adaptation happened faster than seemed possible, that human brains were remarkably good at normalizing the extraordinary, but he stayed quiet because she needed to experience this herself without his interference. The fountain's splash had become Kate's anchor point in the chaos of new sounds, familiar visual pattern now connected to audio component that made sense in ways that other sounds didn't yet. She kept looking at the fountain and listening to its rhythm, using it as reference point to calibrate other sounds against, building mental framework for understanding auditory world, through comparison to something she could both see and hear simultaneously. Joseph recognized what she was doing, creating system for processing overwhelming input by finding patterns and building structure, and felt pride mixed with concern about how hard her brain was working to accomplish in minutes what most people's brains accomplished over years of gradual development from infancy. A plane flew overhead, leaving contrail across evening sky, and the sound of engines made Kate's eyes widen with wonder as she connected visual of aircraft with audio of its passage. "That's the plane making that sound?" she asked, pointing upward, her voice reflecting amazement at connection between sight and sound that everyone else took for granted, but that was revelation to her. Joseph nodded and explained about engines and distance and how sound traveled, basic physics that suddenly had relevance, because Kate could finally experience the phenomenon, rather than just learning about it theoretically, through visual explanations that couldn't capture what hearing actually felt like in practice. Joseph looked at Ezra with expression that had traveled beyond gratitude into something closer to religious devotion. This homeless boy had accomplished what an empire couldn't, had given Joseph's daughter access to the world that money and violence and power had failed to provide. The debt was infinite and unpayable, the kind of obligation that rewrote fundamental assumptions about value and worth, and what mattered in life built on domination and control. "What's your name?" Joseph asked, his voice steady, despite emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "Your full name." The question carried weight beyond simple introduction. This was formal acknowledgement that the boy had become important, that his identity mattered to a man who'd spent years learning to see most people as tools or obstacles rather than individuals worthy of recognition. "Ezra Park," the boy responded, his voice quiet with exhaustion from adrenaline crash hitting him. Now that danger seemed to have passed. "I'm 10. I've been homeless for 3 years since my mom died in a fire. I sleep in doorways and help people for food because my mom taught me never to beg or steal." The information spilled out with honesty that suggested Ezra understood this moment demanded truth, that normal strategies of hiding and minimizing his situation wouldn't work here. Joseph processed the information with the same analytical precision he applied to business decisions that moved millions of dollars. Homeless 10-year-old who'd survived 3 years on streets, who'd retained moral code and observational skills that had just accomplished medical miracle, who'd risked approaching dangerous stranger because helping mattered more than safety. The boy represented something Joseph had stopped believing existed, genuine goodness that operated without calculation, kindness that expected nothing in return, courage that came from principles rather than strategic advantage. "Not anymore," Joseph said, his voice carrying finality that made Ezra's eyes widen with confusion and tentative hope. "You're not homeless anymore. You're coming home with us." The statement wasn't question or negotiation. It was decree from someone who'd spent decades making decisions that others followed without argument. But unlike orders Joseph usually gave, this one came from gratitude rather than power, from recognition that debt this enormous could never be repaid, but deserved acknowledgement that transcended simple payment. Ezra stared at Joseph with disbelief that fought against hope he'd trained himself never to feel. 3 years on streets had taught him that offers from strangers came with costs he couldn't afford, that kindness masked manipulation, that safety was illusion people used to trap you. But the gratitude in Joseph's eyes looked genuine, and the way Kate smiled at him suggested this family operated by different rules than the world he'd learned to navigate through constant vigilance. "I don't understand," Ezra said carefully, his survival instincts screaming warnings, even as exhaustion made the offer impossibly tempting. "Why would you take me home? You don't know me. I could be anyone." The objection was self-sabotage born from 3 years of learning that good things didn't happen to homeless kids, that miracle moments ended with return to reality where doorways were beds and hunger was constant companion. Joseph's expression shifted into something harder, the businessman who'd built empire through reading people and understanding motivations they didn't recognize in themselves. You approached a dangerous man to help a child you didn't know, risked your life because you saw suffering you thought you could reduce. That tells me more about who you are than 3 years of background checks could reveal. His voice carried conviction that came from decades of evaluating character in situations where mistakes meant death. Kate had been listening to the entire conversation with wonder that came from hearing voices for the first time, processing not just words, but tone and emotion, and all the subtle information sound carried beyond simple meaning. She looked at her father with expression that mixed confusion and hope. "Is Ezra coming to live with us? Can he be my brother?" The questions were innocent, but carried weight that made both men freeze. her child's logic cutting through adult complications with direct desire for outcome that felt right. Joseph's walls, carefully constructed over 20 years of violence and betrayal, crumbled at his daughter's request. Kate wanted Ezra as family, not from obligation, but from genuine affection for the boy who'd given her the world. And Joseph recognized debt that transcended money or power, obligation that demanded more than payment or gratitude. This boy deserved protection, stability, the kind of security that Joseph's resources could provide, but that Ezra's courage had earned rather than purchased. "Yes," Joseph said, the word feeling like surrender and victory simultaneously. "If Ezra wants to, he can live with us. We have a guest house in the back of the property, private space where you'd have your own room, your own bathroom, freedom to come and go." The offer was structured to appeal to someone who'd survived through independence, who might fear cage disguised as sanctuary. Ezra's breath caught with realization that this might be real, that 3 years of survival might end in a park where he'd given everything he had to help someone else. "What about school?" he asked, practical concerns surfacing through emotional overload. "Foster care? The state keeps track of homeless kids. They'll come looking if someone reports I'm staying with you." His survival had depended on avoiding authorities who'd put him in group homes, and the fear of losing newfound safety to bureaucratic intervention felt crushing. Joseph's smile carried darkness that reminded Ezra exactly who he was dealing with, power that operated above normal rules and regulations. "I have lawyers who handle complicated situations. By Monday morning, you'll be my legal ward with paperwork so airtight that no one will question the arrangement. The state won't be a problem." The casual confidence in his voice suggested experience making problems disappear, through means Ezra probably shouldn't examine too closely. Kate grabbed Ezra's hand with excitement that made her bounce slightly, her other hand still gripping her father as she processed overwhelming sensory experience of hearing her own movements and the sounds of her joy. "We can play together every day. I can show you my room and my toys and—" She paused, realization hitting her. "I can hear you when you talk to me. I don't have to just read your lips. This is amazing." The wonder in her voice demolished whatever resistance Ezra might have maintained against accepting Joseph's offer. He'd given this gift to Kate, and now she wanted to share her life with him, not from obligation but genuine desire for his presence. The possibility of belonging somewhere, of being wanted rather than tolerated, of having family again after 3 years of devastating loneliness, felt too enormous to fully process without breaking down completely. "Okay," Ezra whispered, the word barely audible even in the new silence that had fallen between them. "Yes, thank you. I don't know what else to say." Tears he'd been fighting finally spilled over. 3 years of suppressed emotion breaking through defenses that had kept him functional, but had also kept him isolated from the kind of connection Kate was offering so freely. The acceptance felt like stepping off cliff into unknown territory, where Ezra had no map or survival strategies that had kept him alive for 3 years on streets where every decision was calculated risk assessment. Living with Joseph meant entering a world of wealth and power that operated by rules Ezra didn't understand, accepting help from man whose reputation probably included violence and criminality that polite society preferred to ignore, as long as it happened to other people in other neighborhoods. But Joseph had also revealed himself as father, who'd spent 6 years desperately seeking solution to daughter's suffering, man who'd offered home to homeless boy without hesitation, because gratitude demanded more than payment could satisfy, and that contradiction made him human in ways that Ezra's survival instincts recognized as genuine, rather than performance designed to manipulate. Kate's excitement was palpable and overwhelming, her grip on Ezra's hand tightening with enthusiasm that made him wonder if she understood what she was asking for by wanting him as brother. He was damaged in ways that 3 years of homelessness had carved into his personality, hyper-vigilant and slow to trust and prone to hoarding food, because hunger had been constant companion for so long that abundance felt temporary and suspicious. He had nightmares about the fire that killed his mother, woke screaming sometimes in whatever doorway he'd found for the night, carried guilt about surviving when she hadn't that therapy might help, but that streets had no room for processing, because survival required forward momentum rather than backward reflection. Joseph saw Ezra's hesitation and recognized it as reasonable caution, rather than rejection of offer being extended. "You'll have your own space," he repeated, emphasis on autonomy, designed to appeal to someone who'd survived through maintaining control over his circumstances, even when those circumstances were terrible. "Guest house has locks on doors that only you control. You can leave whenever you want. I'm not trying to trap you or own you or control your life. This is offer of safety and resources, not cage disguised as sanctuary. The reassurance came from understanding that trust was earned rather than demanded, that Ezra's wariness was adaptive response to world that had taught him that safety was temporary illusion. People used to lower your guard before taking advantage. Margaret had been listening from distance, giving them space for a moment that felt too intimate for outsider observation, but she'd heard enough to understand basic situation and had already begun mental planning for logistics that would transform homeless child into household member with minimum trauma and maximum support. She'd worked with enough difficult situations in Joseph's business operations to know that good intentions without practical execution led to disasters that hurt everyone involved, and she was determined that Ezra's transition would be handled with competence that matched the compassion motivating it. Her mind cataloged needs: clothing, medical care, educational assessment, psychological evaluation that wouldn't feel like interrogation, legal documentation that would protect him from foster care system that had already failed him once. And she began prioritizing what needed to happen immediately versus what could wait until he'd had time to adjust to new reality. Joseph pulled both children into embrace that felt foreign after years of touching people only with violence or strategic manipulation. Kate's arms wrapped around both of them with strength surprising for 6-year-old, and Ezra let himself be held for the first time since his mother died, pushing him toward exits while smoke filled her lungs. The three of them formed unit in the middle of Penn Valley Park, while families played around them in oblivious normalcy, unaware that miracle had just occurred not through medical intervention, but through homeless boy's memory and courage. "We should go home," Joseph said finally, his voice rough with emotion he'd spent decades learning to suppress. "Kate needs to rest. Her brain is processing more sensory information than it's ever handled before, and Ezra needs food, shower, real bed, all the things he's been surviving without." The practical concerns helped ground moment that threatened to overwhelm all three of them, gave structure to transformation that felt too enormous to navigate without concrete next steps. They walked toward the Mercedes as unit, Kate between the two of them holding both their hands, her head constantly swiveling to track sounds she'd never experienced before. Birds, wind, distant conversations, car engines. Everything was discovery that made her gasp or smile or ask questions that Joseph answered with patience that surprised him. Ezra walked in daze, unable to fully believe that his life had changed this completely in the 30 seconds it took to extract compacted cerumen from a little girl's ear. Joseph's security team maintained distance, but tracked their movement with professional attention, noting the homeless boy now walking with their boss and his daughter, already adjusting protection protocols to include third person in security calculations. They'd seen Joseph make impossible decisions before, but this one registered as significant in ways that went beyond normal operational parameters. This was personal in ways that made it both more important and potentially more dangerous. The Mercedes's interior was luxury Ezra had never experienced. Leather seats that were softer than any bed he'd slept in for 3 years. Climate control that made Kansas City heat disappear instantly. Space that felt designed for comfort rather than mere transportation. Kate climbed in beside him instead of taking her usual spot, unwilling to separate from the boy who'd given her hearing, treating him like treasure she might lose if she looked away. Joseph started the engine, and the sound made Kate jump again. Another noise she'd never heard that now existed in her expanding catalog of auditory experience. "Everything is so loud," she repeated, wonder and slight overwhelm mixing in her voice. "Is it always like this? Do you hear everything all the time?" The questions reflected her attempt to understand how other people had been experiencing worlds she'd only accessed through partial senses. The mansion's iron gates opened automatically as the Mercedes approached, revealing property that made Ezra's breath catch, with combination of awe and intimidation. The main house sprawled across landscaped grounds that probably cost more to maintain monthly than most families earned yearly. Architecture that mixed old-world elegance with modern security features disguised as decorative elements. This was wealth beyond anything Ezra had encountered even in imagination, world where homelessness and hunger existed only as distant abstractions rather than daily reality. A woman emerged from the main house as they pulled into the circular driveway, her movement suggesting she'd been watching for their return. She was perhaps 35, Asian features and professional clothes that marked her as someone important to household operations. Her expression shifted from casual welcome to sharp concern as she noticed the unfamiliar child in the back seat, Protective instinct evaluating potential threat before recognition of context could moderate response. Joseph cut the engine and turned to face both children before anyone exited the vehicle. "That's Margaret Chen, my sister-in-law. She manages my legitimate businesses and lives in the west wing of the main house. She's going to have questions about Ezra, and I'm going to answer them honestly, which means she'll learn about Kate's hearing before Kate can tell her herself." The explanation was preparation for interaction that was about to become complicated, warning that privacy of their miracle moment was ending. Kate bounded from the car with energy that 6 years of silence hadn't contained, running toward Margaret with excitement that transcended her usual reserved greeting. "Aunt Margaret! Aunt Margaret, I can hear." The words came out slightly too loud because Kate hadn't yet learned volume control, hadn't developed auditory feedback that taught most people how to modulate their voice for different situations. But the joy in her announcement was unmistakable, transforming her entire presence. Margaret froze mid-step, her face cycling through disbelief, hope, confusion, and dawning wonder as Kate's words registered. "What? How?" She looked past Kate to Joseph with expression demanding explanation, for claim that seemed impossible given 6 years of failed medical interventions. Her eyes caught on Ezra hovering uncertainly near the Mercedes, putting together pieces that didn't yet form complete picture, but suggested something extraordinary had occurred. Joseph approached with Ezra slightly behind him, protective positioning that communicated the boy's new status as someone under his protection, rather than stranger requiring scrutiny. "This is Ezra Park. He's 10 years old. He's been homeless for 3 years, and about an hour ago, he removed impacted cerumen from Kate's ear that 23 specialists somehow missed. She can hear now, actually hear, and Ezra is coming to live with us starting immediately." The information dump was characteristic of Joseph's communication style. Efficient delivery of essential facts without embellishment or apology, statement of decisions already made rather than proposals requiring approval. Margaret processed the explanation with visible effort, her analytical mind working through implications, while emotion threatened to overwhelm professional composure she'd cultivated through years of managing chaos Joseph's lifestyle generated. "Impacted cerumen," Margaret repeated, her voice flat with disbelief that such simple explanation had eluded sophisticated medical investigation. "Earwax. 6 years of specialists, and the problem was earwax." She laughed suddenly, sound mixing hysteria with genuine amusement at cosmic joke that had caused so much suffering for such ridiculous reason. Then her focus shifted entirely to Ezra, assessment changing from threat evaluation to recognition of debt that could never be adequately repaid. She crossed the distance between them in 3 quick steps, and pulled Ezra into a hug that startled him with its intensity and warmth. "Thank you," Margaret whispered against his hair, her voice breaking with emotion she rarely allowed herself to display. "Thank you for giving her something we couldn't, for seeing what everyone else missed, for being brave enough to help." The gratitude was genuine and overwhelming, making Ezra stiffen with discomfort at physical affection from stranger, even as part of him desperately wanted to accept the comfort being offered. Margaret released him and stepped back, professional composure reasserting itself as she evaluated the practical situation. He'll need clothes, toiletries, school supplies, medical checkup, dental work probably, documentation for school enrollment. She was already building mental checklist of what homeless child would require to transition into normal life, her organizational skills deploying to transform abstract compassion into concrete action items. "Guest house is fine for immediate setup," Joseph said, moving conversation toward logistics that gave everyone structure to process emotional overload. "Tomorrow we'll handle documentation, shopping, medical appointments, everything else. Tonight he just needs food, shower, sleep in actual bed." The plan was minimal, but adequate, acknowledging that Ezra's immediate needs were basic rather than complex. Ezra found his voice finally, pushing past overwhelming gratitude and disbelief to address practical concern that had haunted him since Joseph's offer. "I don't have any money. I can't pay you back for any of this. I don't want to be charity case or burden or—" The objection spilled out before he could stop it, pride and fear mixing into protest against dependence that felt dangerous even as it felt necessary. Margaret's expression softened with understanding that came from her own history Joseph had never fully explained to Ezra, but that informed her immediate empathy. "You gave Kate her hearing. That's not a debt we could repay if we spent the rest of our lives trying. You're not charity. You're family now, whether you're comfortable with that yet or not." Her voice carried finality that matched Joseph's earlier declaration. Two people deciding Ezra's fate with confidence that brooked no argument. Margaret's own story included immigration from Taiwan at age 12, with parents who'd worked 3 jobs each to afford tiny apartment in Kansas City's deteriorating Chinatown district, understanding poverty and displacement in ways that connected her immediately to Ezra's experience despite surface differences in their circumstances. She'd clawed her way to business degree through community college and state university while working full-time, built expertise in financial management that had attracted Joseph's attention when he'd needed someone to legitimize his business operations without asking uncomfortable questions about where money originated. Her sister's marriage to Joseph's cousin had brought her into family orbit, and her competence had kept her there even after her sister died from cancer 5 years ago, leaving Kate motherless and Joseph devastated in ways he'd never acknowledged publicly, but that Margaret had witnessed in private moments when grief overwhelmed his carefully maintained control. The connection between Margaret and Ezra was immediate and unexpected, recognition passing between two people who'd survived circumstances that should have destroyed them, but had instead forged resilience that looked like strength, but felt like constant vigilance against next disaster. She saw in his eyes the same hyper-awareness she'd carried for decades after immigration, same calculation of exits and evaluation of threats, and reluctance to fully relax even in supposedly safe spaces, because safety was privilege that could be revoked without warning. Her empathy came from lived experience rather than abstract compassion, understanding that offering him room and food wasn't enough. He'd need time and patience and consistent proof that this wasn't temporary arrangement that would end when gratitude wore off, or when his presence became inconvenient to people who had better options. Joseph watched Margaret interact with Ezra, and felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with Kate's miracle, and everything to do with recognition that he'd been deliberately ignoring for months. Margaret moved through his world with competence that made chaos manageable, and compassion that made his daughter feel loved when his own emotional availability was limited by years of training himself not to feel too much or trust too deeply. She'd been managing his legitimate businesses for 3 years, living in West Wing of Mansion as family member who wasn't quite family, but was too important to categorize as mere employee, existing in liminal space that protected both of them from acknowledging attraction that was obvious to everyone except perhaps themselves. Watching her welcome Ezra with immediate acceptance made Joseph wonder if he'd been a fool to maintain distance from women who understood his life's complications without judgment or demands for changes he wasn't ready to make. Kate had been exploring sounds of the garden during adult conversation, discovering fountains splash and wind chimes melody and gravel crunching under her feet as she walked paths she'd traveled 100 times in silence. She ran back to the group with flowers she'd picked, presenting it to Ezra with ceremony that suggested significant gesture. "This is for you, for making me here. You're my hero." The simple declaration from 6-year-old carried weight that sophisticated thank yous couldn't match, child's absolute sincerity cutting through Ezra's defenses more effectively than adult reassurances. He accepted the flower with hands that trembled, unable to speak past emotion clogging his throat, aware that his life had transformed completely in the hours since he'd woken in doorway across Kansas City, wondering where breakfast might come from. "Let's get you both inside," Margaret said, her voice gentle as she guided them toward the guest house with efficiency that suggested she'd already mentally prepared the space for occupant. "Ezra, you'll stay in the guest house tonight, and tomorrow we'll make it properly yours. Kate, you need to rest. Your brain has been working overtime processing new sensory information, and exhaustion is going to hit you soon if it hasn't already." The guest house was a small mansion in its own right, 2 bedrooms with attached bathrooms, full kitchen, living area with furniture that probably cost more than Ezra's mother had earned in years of nursing work. Margaret showed him the bedroom that would be his with matter-of-fact practicality that made extraordinary situation feel almost normal, pointing out shower controls and promising to bring clothes that might fit temporarily until proper shopping could occur tomorrow. Left alone in bedroom with actual bed and clean sheets and door that locked from inside for privacy rather than protection, Ezra finally let himself break down completely. 3 years of suppressed grief and fear and exhaustion poured out in sobs that shook his entire body. Release of pressure he'd been containing since his mother died in fire saving him. He'd survived by staying strong, by never letting anyone see weakness that could be exploited, by maintaining control through situations that would have broken most adults. But here, in this room that represented safety he'd stopped believing existed, he could finally let go. 3 years passed with momentum that transformed all their lives in ways that first evening in Penn Valley Park had only hinted at. Ezra was 13 now, sitting in 8th grade honors classes at prestigious private school, where Margaret had enrolled him after summer of intensive tutoring, caught him up on education he'd missed during homeless years. His teachers praised his analytical abilities and emotional intelligence, qualities that had kept him alive on streets now deployed toward academic achievement that suggested college scholarships were inevitable rather than aspirational. Kate was 9, and thriving in ways that made those 6 years of silence seem like distant nightmare rather than recent reality. Her speech had developed with help from therapist Dr. Brennan, who'd cried openly when Joseph called to share that Kate could finally hear the pronunciation correction she'd been giving for years. Kate's voice had lost its flat quality, developing inflections and modulations that came from hearing herself and adjusting accordingly, though she still occasionally spoke too loudly when excited. The relationship between Kate and Ezra had evolved into genuine sibling dynamic that surprised everyone with its depth and normalcy. They fought over bathroom time and borrowed belongings, defended each other against outside threats with ferocity that made Joseph simultaneously proud and concerned, shared inside jokes that referenced experiences no one else understood. Kate called him her brother without qualification or hesitation, and Ezra had stopped flinching when she said it. Joseph had changed in ways more subtle but no less significant than the children's transformations. The ruthlessness that built his empire remained, but it was tempered now by awareness that some things mattered more than power and control. He'd started transitioning legitimate businesses to majority ownership, slowly extracting himself from criminal operations in ways that wouldn't trigger war with rivals or attention from FBI agents who'd been investigating him for over a decade. Margaret had been helping with the transition, her financial expertise making complex restructuring possible. Margaret herself had become more than sister-in-law and business manager. She'd become essential to household operations and family cohesion in ways that had gradually shifted her relationship with Joseph into something neither of them had planned or discussed openly. They'd been dancing around mutual attraction for 2 years now, both aware of feelings neither had acted on, maintaining professional distance that was becoming increasingly difficult to justify. Ezra and Kate had noticed, and had begun making pointed comments about adults being oblivious, their child's logic insisting that people who loved each other should say so. The guest house had been transformed into Ezra's domain, decorated with posters from movies he'd discovered, and books Margaret kept buying him faster than he could read them. His room reflected both his past and present. Homeless survival skills remained sharp, even as he lived in luxury. Backpack still packed by the door with essentials in case everything disappeared and he needed to run. Joseph understood the precaution, and never commented on it, recognizing that trust came slowly to people who'd learned that safety was temporary illusion, rather than permanent state. Kate's bedroom in the main house had become sensory wonderland, filled with musical instruments and sound-making toys, and recordings of birdsong and ocean waves that she played on repeat to make up for 6 years of silence. She developed particular love for piano that Margaret had been teaching her to play, her progress remarkable for someone who'd only been hearing music for 3 years. Dr. Brennan suggested Kate's brain might be compensating for lost time by hyper-focusing on auditory processing, making up for developmental delays through intensified engagement. The program that had started accidentally through Ezra's arrival had grown into formal initiative that Joseph funded and Margaret managed. Tom's Law, named after homeless boy in different city who'd inspired similar program, had placed 47 children from Kansas City streets into stable homes over 3 years, screening families and providing support services that gave kids alternatives to foster care system that had failed so many. Ezra trained volunteers on how to spot medical issues professionals might miss, his story becoming legend that gave other homeless kids hope that transformation was possible. The media had tried repeatedly to cover the story of Mafia boss who'd become children's advocate, journalists smelling human interest angle that would drive ratings and subscriptions through combination of redemption narrative and criminal intrigue. Joseph had refused every interview request with threats that made reporters reconsider their career choices, unwilling to expose Kate and Ezra to scrutiny that would reduce their lives to entertainment for people who'd forget them by next news cycle. Margaret had been more diplomatic in her refusals, explaining that the program's success depended on privacy for families involved, that publicity would attract wrong kind of attention from people who saw vulnerable children as opportunities rather than humans deserving protection. The journalists had eventually backed off when it became clear that pursuing the story would result in consequences that exceeded potential benefits of publication. Kate had become unexpectedly fierce advocate for homeless children after meeting some of the kids Ezra's program had helped. Her natural empathy amplified by understanding what it felt like to be trapped in a situation that seemed permanent, until someone saw what others missed and offered help that changed everything. She'd convinced her school to partner with Tom's Law for Service Learning Project, organizing donation drives and awareness campaigns with enthusiasm that impressed teachers who'd initially worried about 6-year-old who'd just gained hearing, taking on ambitious social justice initiative. Her presentations mixed personal testimony with practical information, using her own story as proof that impossible transformations happened when people cared enough to look closely and act courageously, despite not knowing if their efforts would succeed. Ezra's relationship with education had evolved from survival necessity to genuine passion, his natural curiosity finally given resources and time to explore subjects that interested him beyond immediate practical application. He'd discovered particular aptitude for medicine and psychology, fascinated by questions of how bodies worked, and how trauma shaped development, and how healing happened in contexts where damage seemed permanent. His teachers noted that he asked questions that revealed sophisticated understanding of human vulnerability, drawing connections between biological systems and social structures that most 8th graders wouldn't recognize without prompting. College counselors were already discussing scholarship opportunities at prestigious universities where his unique background would be valued as much as his academic achievements. The therapist Margaret had insisted Ezra see weekly had helped him process grief and guilt about his mother's death, gradually loosening the chokehold those emotions had maintained on his ability to imagine future beyond simple survival. Dr. Patterson specialized in childhood trauma and had decades of experience helping kids who'd survived impossibility and emerged damaged but not destroyed, functional but carrying wounds that required professional attention to heal rather than simply scar over. Ezra had resisted therapy initially with street-learned suspicion of adults who asked too many questions about feelings when basic needs still felt uncertain, but Dr. Patterson's patient competence had eventually convinced him that healing was possible and worthwhile, even though it hurt worse than ignoring pain, and pretending strength meant never admitting vulnerability. Joseph's legitimate businesses now employed 12 formerly homeless teenagers in after-school programs that paid well and taught marketable skills, investment in human potential that felt foreign but increasingly right. Margaret had structured the programs to be self-sustaining, proving that compassion could coexist with fiscal responsibility, that helping people didn't require sacrificing business sense. The FBI had noticed the charitable work and had actually backed off slightly on their investigation. Agents apparently conflicted about pursuing man who was simultaneously criminal and benefactor. The spring wedding was scheduled for June, small ceremony in the mansion's garden where Kate would serve as flower girl, and Ezra would walk Margaret down the aisle and gesture that honored the family they'd built together. Joseph had proposed during Christmas with awkwardness that made Kate and Ezra laugh. Powerful man reduced to nervous uncertainty by question that felt more terrifying than any physical danger he'd faced. Margaret had said yes before he'd finished asking, her own composure cracking as she'd acknowledged what they'd both known for years, but had been too cautious to voice. Kate practiced piano in the main house, while Ezra studied in the guest house, their evening routine comfortable in ways that 3 years ago would have seemed impossible to boy sleeping in doorways and girl living in silence. Sometimes Ezra still woke in panic, thinking he was back on streets. That transformation had been dream, and he'd returned to reality of hunger and danger. But then he'd hear Kate's piano drifting across the garden, sound that proved miracles were real, and second chances existed for kids who'd survived what should have destroyed them. The fountain in Penn Valley Park had become pilgrimage site for their family, place they visited monthly to remember where everything changed. Joseph would sit on the same bench where he'd waited while Kate played, and Ezra would position himself where he'd first noticed her ear touching and recognized what specialists had missed. They'd recreated that afternoon hundreds of times in conversation, examining it from different angles, finding new meaning in decisions that had felt random, but had aligned into transformation that saved multiple lives. The compacted ceremen that Ezra had extracted remained in small display case in Joseph's office, preserved as evidence of miracle that expensive medicine had missed and homeless boy had solved in 30 seconds. Visitors sometimes asked about it, and Joseph would tell the story with pride that felt foreign to man who'd built reputation on intimidation rather than sentiment. But the story mattered because it proved that value existed outside power structures, that wisdom came from unexpected sources, that sometimes the person who saved you was the one you'd least expect. Margaret had framed photograph from that evening in the park. Security footage she'd obtained showing moment when Kate first heard sound, her face transformed by wonder and shock. The image hung in the living room where everyone could see it. Reminder that family wasn't always biological, that love could be chosen rather than inherited, that the best things in life often came from moments when you risked everything to help someone else without knowing if they could help you back. Kate had become advocate for hearing health, speaking at schools about her experience with support from Dr. Brennan, who'd helped her develop presentation skills. She'd met other children with hearing issues, and had shared her story with a mix of humility and pride that made adults and audience cry openly. Her message was simple. Never stop looking for answers. Never assume experts have found everything. Never underestimate importance of someone who cares enough to look closely when everyone else has stopped looking at all. Ezra had reconnected with Phil at Morton's diner, bringing Kate and Joseph to meet the man who'd fed him during desperate times. Phil had refused Joseph's offer of money with dignity that earned permanent respect, saying that helping Ezra had been privilege rather than burden, that watching him thrive was payment enough. They'd established tradition of Thursday breakfasts at Morton's, family ritual that honored where Ezra came from while celebrating where he'd arrived, bridge between past survival and present security. The future stretched ahead with possibilities that had seemed impossible 3 years ago in Park, where homeless boy pulled something unbelievable from Mafia boss's daughter's ear and changed 3 lives forever. College applications waited in Ezra's future. Piano recitals filled Kate's calendar. Margaret and Joseph's wedding promised new chapter for family that had been accidentally assembled, but had become deliberately maintained. They'd learned that family was verb rather than noun, action chosen daily rather than state inherited automatically. And they'd learned that sometimes the greatest gifts came wrapped in moments of courage when you helped someone else, even though, especially though, you had nothing to gain and everything to lose. Thank you all for following this story. If you're enjoying it, please write in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Your support means everything and helps me continue bringing you stories like this one. This journey from silence to sound, from loneliness to family, from desperation to hope. It's a reminder that miracles happen when courage meets compassion, and sometimes the person who saves your life is the one you'd never expect.